March 27, 1943, 13:20 hours. Longstop Hill, Tunisia. Oberst Heinrich Müller watched through his binoculars as British tanks approached his defensive position, their distinctive shapes recognizable even through the dust and heat haze. Churchills, the British heavy infantry tanks that German intelligence had described as obsolete designs, too slow for modern warfare, equipped with inadequate guns. His anti-tank crews had positioned their weapons carefully, covering the approaches with interlocking fields of fire. The Churchills would have to advance up the slope toward his position, exposing themselves to his guns at ranges where penetration should be certain. The first Churchill came into effective range at 800 meters. Müller's lead gun fired, the armor-piercing round striking the tank's turret with impact clearly visible through binoculars. The tank continued advancing. Another shot, this time hitting the glacis plate. Still, the Churchill came on. A third shot, a fourth, each hitting but none achieving penetration. The British tank reached 500 meters, then 400, methodically climbing the rocky slope, while German shells struck it repeatedly without effect. Müller felt cold recognition settling in his stomach. This wasn't supposed to happen. His 50mm anti-tank guns were adequate against most Allied armor at these ranges. The Churchills should be burning wrecks by now, their crews dead or bailing out. Instead, they kept advancing, absorbing hits that should have been lethal, returning fire with their 6-pounder guns that might not be powerful but were certainly effective against his unarmored anti-tank positions. "It's impossible," he muttered. "It should be burning already." But it wasn't burning. None of them were. The entire column of Churchills was advancing through fire that should have stopped them, their thick armor simply defeating rounds that would have destroyed lighter tanks. Müller watched as the lead Churchill reached his forward positions, crushed a machine gun nest under its tracks, and began engaging his anti-tank guns at point-blank range. His carefully prepared defense was being overrun by tanks moving at walking pace, tanks that everyone had said were obsolete, tanks that were proving immune to weapons that should have killed them easily. He ordered withdrawal before his entire position was annihilated. As his surviving crews fell back, he took one final look at the Churchills consolidating their positions on the hill they'd just captured. The tanks were scarred and scorched, bearing evidence of dozens of hits, but they were intact and operational. Müller had fought on the Eastern Front, had faced Soviet armor in desperate battles, but he'd never encountered tanks quite like these, slow, ungainly things that simply refused to die no matter how many times you hit them. The desperate beginning. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, Britain faced military crisis that threatened national survival. The army had abandoned most of its heavy equipment during Dunkirk evacuation. Tank production was inadequate for rebuilding armored forces. Existing tank designs were proving inferior to German armor in combat. Britain needed new tanks immediately, but lacked time for careful development programs that might produce superior designs years hence. The first Churchills emerged from factories in June 1941, barely a year after specification was issued. They were disasters. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, tracks broke, electrical systems malfunctioned. The tanks could barely move, much less fight. British tank crews who received them were appalled. The Churchill was slower than infantry walking pace, broke down constantly, and mounted gun that was already obsolete. The tanks seemed to embody everything wrong with rushed wartime production, inadequate testing, compromised design, desperate improvisation producing weapon that barely functioned. British military leadership seriously considered cancelling Churchill production and focusing resources on other designs. But Winston Churchill personally intervened. insisting that the tank bearing his name wouldn't be abandoned. He ordered comprehensive redesign to address mechanical failures while maintaining the basic concept of heavily armored infantry support tank. The decision was partly personal pride. He wouldn't accept tank named after him being failure, but also reflected strategic judgment that Britain needed heavy tanks for assault operations, even if those tanks were slow and ungainly. Engineers at Vauxhall Motors, which was producing Churchills, worked systematically through the failures. The cooling system was redesigned with improved radiators and airflow. The transmission was strengthened with heavier components and better lubrication. The tracks were widened and reinforced. The electrical system was simplified and better protected. By mid-1942, Churchill Mark III incorporated these improvements and proved reasonably reliable under operational conditions. Not perfect, but functional enough for combat use. The armor was Churchill's greatest strength, and one aspect that didn't require redesign. The frontal armor was up to 152 millimeters thick, making it the most heavily armored British tank and better protected than most German tanks. The armor was well sloped on the turret and reasonable on the hull. Against anti-tank guns of 50 millimeter or smaller caliber, Churchill was effectively immune at combat ranges. Even the German 75 millimeter guns that equipped Panthers and Panzer IVs struggled to penetrate Churchill frontally at ranges beyond a few hundred meters. The gun remained problematic. The original 2-pounder was clearly inadequate by 1942 standards. The upgrade to 6-pounder improved matters but still left Churchill undergunned compared to German tanks with 75 millimeter or 88 millimeter weapons. British doctrine accepted this limitation. Churchill was infantry support tank designed to accompany foot soldiers and destroy fortifications, not tank destroyer meant for engaging enemy armor at long range. The 6-pounder was adequate for supporting infantry and destroying bunkers, which was Churchill's primary role. The mobility was deliberately limited. Churchill's maximum speed was approximately 15 miles per hour on roads, slower cross-country. This made it useless for exploitation operations or rapid maneuver. But speed hadn't been the design priority. Armor and trench crossing capability had been. Churchill could cross obstacles that stopped faster tanks. Its wide tracks distributed weight effectively, allowing it to traverse soft ground where other tanks bogged down. Its low gearing provided excellent climbing ability on steep slopes. The tank was slow, but it was also extremely capable in difficult terrain, which proved valuable in operations where speed mattered less than ability to advance through challenging ground. Italy, the siege engine. The Italian campaign provided ideal conditions for Churchill's capabilities. Mountainous terrain, narrow roads, defended villages that required methodical assault rather than rapid maneuver. Italy's geography favored defensive operations. Mountains channeled movement along predictable routes. Rivers required bridging under fire. Villages and towns provided strong defensive positions. German forces exploited these advantages to conduct fighting withdrawal that delayed Allied advance through series of defensive lines that required frontal assault. The tactical situation demanded armor that could support infantry in deliberate attacks against prepared positions, exactly the role Churchill had been designed for. Churchill's proved invaluable in these conditions. Their armor protected against German anti-tank weapons in close terrain where engagement ranges were short. Their mobility in difficult terrain allowed them to support infantry through mountains and across soft ground that bogged down lighter tanks. Their ability to absorb punishment meant they could lead assaults where lighter tanks would be destroyed. British infantry learned to appreciate Churchill's as mobile cover that allowed advances that would otherwise be suicidal against German defensive fire. The tank's ability to cross obstacles proved particularly valuable. Churchill could cross wider trenches than other Allied tanks due to its long hull. It could ford deeper rivers. It could climb steeper slopes. These capabilities allowed British forces to attack positions that German defenders assumed were protected by terrain, creating tactical surprise when Churchill's appeared where German intelligence had believed tanks couldn't operate. One engagement near Cassino demonstrated Churchill's endurance dramatically. A single Churchill tank was hit over 80 times by German anti-tank weapons during prolonged engagement but remained operational, continuing to support infantry while absorbing fire that would have destroyed any other Allied tank multiple times over. The incident became legendary among British tank crews and infantry, reinforcing confidence in Churchill's protective capabilities and willingness to continue operations despite damage that would disable lighter armor. North Africa. The raid on Dieppe was poorly planned operation that ended in catastrophic failure for Canadian forces that bore the assault's brunt. Churchills were landed to support the Canadians, but most were disabled on the beaches by obstacles, German fire, or mechanical failures. Of the 30 Churchills deployed, none returned to Britain. The tanks that made it off the beach fought effectively for brief periods before being destroyed or abandoned, but the overall impression was of another British tank failure. But German examination of captured Churchills revealed surprising capabilities. The armor was impressive, substantially thicker than German intelligence had estimated. The mechanical systems, while crude, were robust and maintainable. The tank's ability to cross obstacles was remarkable. German reports acknowledged that while Churchill was slow and undergunned, it was also extremely well protected and potentially dangerous in roles where its mobility limitations weren't critical. Churchill's redemption came in North Africa, where terrain and tactical situations played to its strengths. The fighting in Tunisia's hills required tanks capable of climbing steep slopes and advancing through rocky terrain that defeated lighter vehicles. Churchills proved ideal for these conditions. Their excellent armor protected against German anti-tank guns. Their low gearing allowed them to climb slopes that American Shermans couldn't negotiate. Their reliability, improved since Dieppe, allowed sustained operations despite harsh conditions. The Battle of Longstop Hill demonstrated Churchill's effectiveness when employed appropriately. British infantry advancing up steep rocky slopes faced German positions that commanded excellent fields of fire. Lighter tanks couldn't provide adequate support. They struggled with the terrain and were vulnerable to German anti-tank fire. Churchills advanced steadily, absorbing hits while climbing slopes that seemed impassable, providing mobile cover that allowed infantry to advance. The tank's armor proved effective against German 50mm and some 75mm guns, creating situations where German anti-tank crews fired repeatedly without achieving penetrations. German defenders at Longstop and subsequent battles in Tunisia developed genuine concern about Churchills. Intelligence reports described them as extremely heavily armored and difficult to destroy with standard anti-tank weapons. Tactical guidance recommended that Churchills should be engaged only with larger caliber guns or at very close range where armor could be penetrated reliably. The recognition that British tank, once dismissed as obsolete, was actually a formidable opponent forced tactical adjustments that acknowledged Churchill's effectiveness within its design parameters. Normandy, the mature design. By June 1944, Churchill had evolved from mechanical disaster to proven weapon system with capabilities that German forces genuinely feared. The Normandy campaign's terrain favored Churchill employment. Bocage country, with small fields, high hedgerows, narrow roads, and limited maneuver space, created conditions where armor supported infantry in close combat rather than conducting independent operations. Churchill's thick armor and specialized variants proved ideal for methodical advance through defended terrain. AVREs demolished fortifications. Crocodiles cleared stubborn defenders. Infantry followed behind Churchill armor that absorbed German fire while advancing through terrain that channeled movement and maximized defensive advantages. German intelligence had updated its assessment of Churchill substantially since 1942. Reports acknowledged the tank's excellent armor and warned that standard anti-tank weapons were ineffective frontally. Tactical guidance recommended avoiding engagement with Churchills unless using large-caliber guns or achieving flanking positions where thinner side armor could be penetrated. The recognition that Churchill required special tactical considerations elevated it from dismissed obsolete design to respected threat that demanded careful countermeasures. The psychological impact of crocodile flamethrowers proved particularly significant. German troops who'd maintained defensive positions against conventional attacks would surrender immediately when crocodiles appeared, recognizing that the alternative to surrender was being burned alive. The weapon's effectiveness came not primarily from its lethality, but from the terror it produced, breaking defensive positions through psychological shock rather than through actual destruction. By war's end, Churchills had participated in virtually every major British operation from Tunisia through Germany. The tank that had begun as embarrassing failure had become reliable, effective weapon that British forces valued for its durability and specialized capabilities. It wasn't the best tank. It was slow, undergunned, and limited in roles it could perform effectively. But within its design parameters of infantry support in difficult terrain against prepared defenses, it was an excellent solution that had proven itself through sustained combat operations. The German perspective initial German intelligence from 1941-1942 described Churchill as obsolete design, too slow for modern warfare, inadequately armed, presumably vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. These assessments reflected pre-war assumptions about tank design that prioritized mobility and gunpowder over armor protection. By those standards, Churchill was indeed obsolete. It was slower than most contemporary designs and mounted guns that were becoming inadequate against improving German armor. Combat experience forced reassessment. German anti-tank crews discovered that 50mm guns couldn't reliably penetrate Churchill frontally at combat ranges. Even 75mm guns struggled against the tank's thick frontal armor. The Churchill's ability to absorb multiple hits and continue operating was documented in numerous after-action reports that described tanks being struck repeatedly without achieving kills. German tankers learned to target Churchills from flanks, where armor was thinner, or to avoid engagement entirely unless possessing overwhelming advantage. The specialized variants provoked particular German concern. AVREs could destroy fortifications that German defenders assumed were secure against tank attack. Crocodiles broke defensive positions that had resisted conventional assault. The variety of Churchill variants created tactical complications. German forces couldn't simply employ standard anti-tank tactics, but had to identify which variant they faced and adjust accordingly. By 1944, German tactical doctrine treated Churchills as serious threats, requiring careful countermeasures. Frontline troops respected the tank's armor and capabilities even while recognizing its limitations. intelligence assessments acknowledged that within its specialized role, Churchill was an effective weapon that British forces employed competently. The transformation from dismissed obsolete design to respected opponent validated British decision to persist with Churchill's development despite its troubled beginnings. The specialized variants. Churchill's greatest contribution to Allied victory came through specialized variants that exploited the tank's strengths while addressing specific tactical challenges. The AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, mounted short-barreled mortar firing enormous high-explosive charges designed to destroy fortifications. The weapon had minimal range and accuracy, but devastating effect against bunkers and obstacles. AVREs would advance to point-blank range, absorb defensive fire with their heavy armor, and deliver demolition charges that could destroy virtually any fortification. The vehicles were essential for breaching German defensive positions throughout Northwest Europe campaign. The Churchill Crocodile was flamethrower variant that combined Churchill's armor with trailer-carrying flamethrower fuel. The flame projector could deliver burning fuel over 100 yards, creating psychological effect out of proportion to its actual lethality. German troops feared flamethrower attacks intensely. The weapons didn't kill efficiently, but did so horrifically when they succeeded. Crocodiles were used to clear fortified positions and bunkers where defenders refused to surrender, with flame attacks typically producing immediate surrender from defenders who'd resisted conventional weapons. Bridge-laying Churchills carried portable bridges that could span gaps up to 30 feet wide, allowing armor to cross obstacles rapidly without engineer support. Mine flail variants cleared paths through minefields, sacrificing the flail tank but preserving following vehicles. Recovery variants could tow disabled tanks from battlefields. The variety of specialized versions transformed Churchill from single-purpose tank into multi-role system that addressed numerous tactical challenges using common chassis and armor. The adaptability reflected Churchill's design characteristics. Long hull provided platform for mounting various equipment. Heavy armor allowed vehicles to approach obstacles or fortifications under fire. Reliable mechanical systems supported sustained operations despite modifications adding weight and complexity. The basic tank had been mediocre, but the variants proved invaluable for specialized roles where Churchill's strengths were decisive and its weaknesses were irrelevant. The final assessment. Churchill represented triumph of persistence and adaptation over elegant design, demonstrating that adequate solutions repeatedly improved can outperform superior solutions that arrive too late or in insufficient quantities. The tank's troubled development and early failures could have justified cancellation. Most military procurement programs that perform as poorly as Churchill did in 1941-1942 would be terminated and replaced with alternatives. But Britain didn't have alternatives that could provide Churchill's capabilities within timeframes that military operations required. So engineers fixed the problems, improved the design, developed specialized variants, and gradually transformed disaster into functional weapon system. The combat record validated the persistence. Churchills participated successfully in every major British operation from 1942 onward. They protected infantry during advances through terrain where other tanks couldn't operate effectively. They destroyed fortifications that conventional weapons couldn't reduce. They absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter vehicles. Within their specialized roles, they were excellent solutions that British forces relied upon and that German forces learned to respect. The psychological impact equaled the physical capabilities. British infantry fighting behind Churchill armor knew they had protection that would absorb defensive fire and allow advances that would otherwise be suicide. German defenders, facing Churchill's, knew they were engaging heavily armored targets that wouldn't be easily destroyed. The mutual recognition, British confidence, and German concern created tactical dynamics that favored British operations even when Churchill's actual combat performance was merely adequate rather than exceptional. The lesson wasn't that slow. Heavily armored tanks were superior design philosophy. It was that adequate solutions that actually exist and can be employed effectively serve better than theoretical superior solutions that aren't available when needed. Churchill was never the best tank in any objective sense. It was slower, less mobile, more poorly armed than various alternatives that existed or were proposed. But it was available, it was survivable, and it was improvable. Those characteristics mattered more than theoretical superiority, making Churchill's success story despite its manifest imperfections. Heinrich Müller, the German officer who'd watched Churchill's advance through fire that should have stopped them at Longstop Hill, survived the war and wrote memoirs that included his experiences in Tunisia. He devoted several paragraphs to Churchill's, describing them as ungainly and slow, but also as remarkably durable and surprisingly effective within their operational parameters. "We learned not to underestimate them," he wrote. "They looked obsolete, but they refused to act obsolete. That stubbornness, very British I suppose, made them more dangerous than more sophisticated tanks that were more fragile." That assessment captured Churchill's essence: stubborn, unfashionable, limited, but within those limits, extremely capable, refusing to fail despite every reason to be dismissed as inadequate. The tank bearing Winston Churchill's name shared characteristics with the man himself: difficult, imperfect, sometimes infuriating, but ultimately effective through sheer refusal to admit defeat. In war where persistence often mattered more than brilliance, where adequate solutions delivered today served better than perfect solutions arriving tomorrow, the Churchill tank was exactly what Britain needed, even when it wasn't what anyone particularly wanted.